like to introduce our next speaker this morning. Some of you might know her. I have a feeling most of you do. Our next speaker will be Charlotte Hefner. Charlotte and her family came to Shawnee in 1992 and was called into the ministry in 2005. Her primary duties began in children's ministry, and after graduation from Bluffton College and Seminary, she served as an associate pastor at Shawnee until going to build a satellite church in Bath. She is currently retired and works part-time at First SUMC in Wapak and volunteers at Family Promise. And I know a lot of people came out to hear her talk today and to reconnect with her. So if we could give a warm welcome for Charlotte Hefner, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Feels way weird to be up here again. This is one of those opportunities I didn't know that I would ever receive, and it is such a gift. It is nice to be with you today, and I'm really grateful. I told Daniel that I didn't have to follow him, so he is awesome, and it's so good to connect with him again. Well, I really struggled with what to share with you, and I usually wait for God to give me a word or a scripture, and the word that he gave me was letters. I love to write letters, and I love to receive letters. Do you know what those are? Does anybody do that anymore? For every 100 pieces of junk mail, I get like one good piece of mail. So I had an elderly aunt, a great aunt actually. She lived in Akron. She was more like my grandmother than my great aunt. And we would go and visit from time to time, but between those times, she would send me letters, and I would return letters. I could not wait to get home from school, open the mailbox, and there would be a letter from mankind. And I would savor every word. It was just like a touch across the miles. She's gone now, and I just kick myself for not having one of those letters that I can hold on to and remember her by. So now I write my aunt. She is at end-stage COPD. She doesn't get out very often. And I write her what's happening with our kids and grandkids, and we share memories, and I love that time. I'm very humbled because I just learned a couple months ago that she was calling her children, my cousins, and reading those letters to her. So I'm a little more careful what I write now. But as I write her again, we share those memories, and it's a chance for us to connect in that way. So this is where I'm going with all of this. I've written you a letter today, hoping that I can capture all the love I have for you. Right now my heart is so full, my mind is going crazy because there are just so many memories when I walk into this building and when I see you again. So my letter to you. My friends of Shawnee, I give thanks to God when I think of you and all that you mean to me and to my family. You've set us on a path that has served us well in these last 30 years of our lives. When we came, our youngest was 2. Does everybody remember Keith? I'm sorry. Keith is actually how we mark time in being here. He was 2 when we came. He is now a husband and a father to 3 little animals, that's what we call them, who are more active than Keith, if you can imagine. You know, we passed this church for years to drive to a church in the inner city of Lima where my husband and I grew up. It's where we were married and baptized, where our kids were raised for a short time, and they also were baptized there. And it was kind of silly that we would pass you every single week. Well, the time came, I was a children's ministry director at this church, and I saw the writing on the wall. I was also going to be the youth director. And we said, you know, we wanted our kids to have so much more than that. So we came to a Christmas Eve service here in 1990, and the Funky Disciple Youth Band was playing. My parents, who came with us, were horrified. But the service that night, I can tell you, was fun. I can never describe a service in our home church as fun. Our 2-year-old was standing on the back pew. He was in total attention of what was going on up front, and our 8- and 7-year-old sat on the edge of their seat. And we were all intrigued. Now, the agreement was that all 5 of us had to agree when we would visit a church if this was the place that we were going to stay. So the kids were in Sunday school one morning, and they were already engulfed in love. Their teachers took them in and began teaching them. And my husband and I, both introverts, were standing against the wall in the education wing, waiting for them to come out of class. And we were hoping that people would see us, but not see us. Does that make sense? When one man came to introduce himself to us, Mark Bollinger, I've told Mark that he'll never know what that welcome meant. He saw us. He simply introduced himself, asked our names. He told us his name, and then we felt welcomed. And I will tell you that we came back a second time because of that welcome. Terry and I were then invited into a home fellowship with Pastor Barry Burns, and we got to meet some really awesome people. It was before the Centrum, but when we would walk into that sanctuary, we could name people's names, and we felt like we belonged. Our kids went on mission trips and served in our community at Bradfield Center and the youth-led soup kitchen. We got on the ground floor of Fall Fest. Now, many of you aren't going to remember, but it was held in the fellowship hall with all 25 of us. The kids played games, and we never, ever imagined. I mean, Ryan can dream, but he couldn't dream of what it would become. Perhaps you'll understand what it means when we witnessed our children who through the years became leaders of their own because of the leaders of this church. When I think of our oldest 2 serving in one of the poorest counties in the United States and making friends there with Willie and Isaiah, working on houses like Miss Sarah's, who had holes in the floor, then you'll understand what a blessing you have been. And Dan Booker and your ramps. You want to talk about butting heads? I'm sorry about my daughter, too. She was a leader even then. She would give him a hard time. We used to joke that the ramps were sturdier than the houses that they were attached to. Again, those days shaped our kids profoundly. You, Shawnee, were so gracious in your love for us that we still often speak of your impact when we talk to others. We tell them that you are a church with a hand out, not to take, but to give. That you walk the walk, not just talk the talk. That you have even given your entire offering more than once, even in economic droughts that made no sense. You have uprooted yourselves on Easter Sunday to move to the school gym so that more people could hear about Jesus. You led community food drives through Harvest for the Hungry and filled a semi with hygiene kits for the people devastated by the earthquake in Haiti. You invited bikers who appeared very different than your average church member and made them feel like family, and they came year after year after year. You've opened your doors for school post-proms and fifth quarters, oodles of kids through VBS, and you've been a soft landing for those who have lost spouses through groups like On Our Own. And some of you will remember those wonderful, awful rummage sales, when we vowed we would never do it again. But we did. Summer camps, church cantatas, Bible studies, Emmaus groups, Canadian fishing trips. Over and over and over again, you've been moved by the impulse of the Holy Spirit's lead, not for your glory, but for God's alone. And this has been true in this church since the circuit rider days, when the circuit rider pastor would travel from home church to home church on horseback in the 1850s. The church motto at that time was never find fault, never do wrong, never go fishing on Sunday. Before the church was built, the people met under an old oak tree for worship and teaching. Years later, Lillian Kramer remembers one of the outside church services, reminiscent of those early days. She took her portable organ outside, and the cows in the pasture walked over to worship with them. She said the cows were very well behaved. Not a single moo was spoken, and throughout the service, the cows seemed to be in an attitude of prayer. And our history also notes that old Walt Sealing, who lived on the farm just across the road, gave hogs as his pledge for the building fund. Would you like that this time, Lori?
We'll take any.
Okay, all right. Bring your chickens, bring your goats, bring your cows. It goes to show that God will use just about anything for his glory. There are so many great stories of our memories before any of us remember being here. There are several that cannot forget, though, when we came into this new building. It didn't have the education wing or the centrum. I've heard the stories, they call it a walking over. Is anybody part of the walkover? One person? Part of the walkover. It was a big deal. Among those were people who would walk, kids that would walk from the children's home that is over where Shawnee Manor is. I didn't really realize that until we had a Sunday school class, and we had people like Wayne Crawford and Ross Stover, who are now gone, share their stories of being kids from that home. And they would come over, and this is the family that they built, where they were accepted and loved. And when the church grew too big for that small building, the church dinners and events would be held either at the children's home or the township house. In less than 10 years, the church grew to over, did I say something offensive? You have to know her, she would do that too. In less than 10 years, the church grew to over 1,000 in attendance, and within 20 years, almost 1,500. There are so many things that you and I didn't have to create because there were many who went before us. Do you know this church is 171 years old? 171 years of faithful people. Sometimes when I think of those years, I have a twinge of sadness because there are some people who were instrumental for our growth, people who make great sacrifices of time and money and comfort who are no longer here. When I walk into this building, I feel surrounded by them. Memories of people like Buzz Alder, Gerald and Lou Goodwin, Barbara Brenneman and now Bob, Pat and Helen Price, Alice Ofstetter, John and Sandy Lockwood, Bob Chrysler, Del and Marilyn Lau, Frank Fisher, and so many more. Some that generations to come will never know. I don't know if you know this, but Frank Fisher gave this church a great gift before his death. He and I worked hard to gather the history of this church. I cannot even tell you the hours that he spent compiling our history, a legacy, so that generations to come would not forget. I've made some copies of a timeline of this church if you'd like to see that and to enjoy part of his work. Frank Fisher, I don't know if you know, was going blind at that time. And there are many mistakes in the history that he made, but I think they're beautiful because that was a sacrifice. Even when he was past his prime, wanted to share. Not only are there people who have gone before because of death, but there have been others who have been moved and graduated to new jobs, created families, and have found opportunities in many places. The seeds of this church have traveled far. In the 1990s, when I was serving as children's ministry director, there was a great exodus from this church. Not because people were upset, because of businesses like Westinghouse and General Dynamics, Procter & Gamble, and others were reshuffling employees. In one summer in the children's ministry alone, I think we lost 12 key families. I don't like goodbyes. I don't like change. And that was a very difficult time. I just remember how hard it was to let them go. But in time, my mindset began to change when I realized that we were like a sending church. We were responsible to help people grow while they were with us. And then we would send them out to spread those seeds wherever they would be planted. Terry and I, my husband and I, became two of those who were sent to a little church called Bath Community in 2011. It was planted as a satellite of Shawnee. That little church had 12 people, and we grew it to be a church of 80. Again, by many sacrifices from not only the people of Bath, but you. I'm grateful that you didn't hold me, but you respected my desire to take a shot at ministry on my own. So many of you visited and kept those connections and cheered us on. It wasn't until I retired in 2016 that I had time to reflect on how, through the years, you had prepared me for that venture. How you loved me when I made mistakes or was really green at the beginning. One lady from Bath took my hand years after I had been at the church, and she said, "Oh my, how you have grown since you first started preaching." And then she laughed. Thanks. You have welcomed me into your hospital rooms, your family funerals and weddings, your celebrations, your challenges and struggles, and because of that, I am who I am today. I'm reminded of the lyrics of the song in the musical Wicked that says, "I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them. And we help them in return. But I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because of you." My hope for you, Shawnee, is that you'll never forget where you began. Very humble beginnings in a little white church just across the driveway, and yet a giant faith who saw possibilities instead of roadblocks, where orphaned children walked to and found family. A church who represents all ages and economic backgrounds, who faithfully and sacrificially gives to missions with their money, but also with their time and their energies, who has declined in numbers several times, and each time was resurrected better than before, who have been fulfilling Jesus' mission to make disciples for the transformation of the world for 171 years and counting, who have loved people right where they are, but didn't leave them there, offering hope in their brokenness and community for their healing, who have laughed and been silly. This is where I insert the Weekenders class. They were our comic relief most of the time. We've eaten together a lot, because that's what United Methodists do. We've prayed together a lot. We've learned, we've been challenged, we've struggled, we've corporately grieved. We have married and buried and baptized and blessed. We have come to the table of God's loving sacrifice and will continue to do it all, again and again. Much has changed here since I left Bath in 2011. You'll notice on the timeline that that's where it ends, not because it's all about me, but because Frank Fisher died and no one else picked up the gauntlet. We need another Frank Fisher to continue your history. But largely, you, Shawnee, remain the same. Your DNA of Jesus continues to be evident. No church is perfect, but you've gotten so much right. And you've sent people like me into the world carrying the seeds of your love and continued to sow. My prayer for you is this, that you will never lose your first love in Jesus Christ, the one who has called you, the one who claims you, the one who has given you purpose. I wish there was a word that could adequately say thank you. I can only say that I am who I am because of you, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte.